Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cam Gordon. I'm chair of the Health, Environment, and Community Engagement Committee, and I'll call this meeting to order. I'm joined right now by Council Members Glidden, Andrew Johnson, and Lisa Bender. I'm sure Jacob Fry will be back in a moment. But we are a quorum of the committee, so we can start the meeting and conduct the committee's business. We have an agenda with 7 items on it. There's 2 discussion items, but there are also 5 consent items, and I go through the consent items first. If any committee member wants to pull something off, or if they have questions or a comment, feel free to do so. The first item is accepting a grant from the Minnesota Department of Health in the amount of $120,000 for 1 year to continue public health nurse home visiting services to high-risk families. The second item is authorizing an amendment to a contract with Stair Step Foundation, increasing the contract by $7,416 for a revised total not to exceed $80,000 to continue to provide diabetes reduction services through the National Diabetes Prevention Program. The third and fourth items have to do with our Skyway Senior Center, and these are good news items. The first is passage of a resolution accepting a donation of $60,000 from the Friends of the Skyway Senior Center to support the operating expenses of the Skyway Senior Center. And the Friends of the Skyway Senior Center wanted me to recognize that this funding is coming from the Mr. and Mrs. Gary J. Haugen Richards Family Advised Fund of the Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee. And it's greatly appreciated. It will really provide a financial bridge to the future, I think, for the Skyway Center. Because of item number 4 is authorizing the Health Department to enter into a letter of intent with Ecumen for a 120-day exclusive dealing period to negotiate details for Ecumen to assume operations of the Skyway Senior Center. And all those 4 items will also be referred to the Ways and Means Committee. Our final consent item is approving council appointments to the Board of Directors of the Community Action Partnership of Suburban Hennepin, serving as the Community Action Program for Minneapolis for terms beginning immediately and ending March 31st, 2019. And the council members will be appointed are myself and Council Member Abdu Warsami. Are there any questions or comments? Anybody want to pull any of those consent items? Seeing none then, all those in favor of those as read and printed, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say no. Those motions carry. Now we're ready for our discussion items. We'll have 2 discussion items. One of them is through the Neighborhood and Community Relations Department. And I think Mr. Robert Thompson will be presenting that to us. That is having to do with our community engagement plan for Neighborhoods 2020, and approving the plan will help us develop a Neighborhoods 2020 recommendations to come back in March. Good afternoon.
Great. Chair Gordon, council members, thank you. What I'd like to talk about today is our proposal for a community engagement plan for the Neighborhoods 2020 project. And I'm also going to be joined here by Dennis Fazio, who is a board member of the Bryn Mawr Neighborhood Association. And I was expecting a couple of Neighborhood and Community Engagement commissioners here too, but I think they were tied up with other commitments, so they weren't able to make it. I know one is en route from Rochester still. So I'll walk through my presentation, but basically, here's what we're recommending. To approve the community engagement plan to develop Neighborhoods 2020 recommendations with proposed completion of the draft recommendations by March 30th, 2018. To approve the resolution transferring $50,000 from NRP post-2009 interest earnings fund to the Neighborhood and Community Relations Department Special Revenue Fund, and increase that fund by $50,000, and then authorizing appropriate city officials to execute contracts consistent with the approved community engagement plan. So the big question is, what is the role of neighborhood organizations after 2020? And what we want to do is involve our community partners in that conversation. As you know, in the late 2000s, we had, as we were looking at transitioning from the NRP program into new neighborhood programs, we had a lot of conversations. And so what we want to do is start talking now about what comes after 2020 for neighborhood programs. And here's Marcus Mills from the Neighborhood and Community Engagement Commission too. What we're doing with this plan is basically following the adopted principles of community engagement. And so you'll see how some of that plays out here. But our goals here with this are to ensure, first of all, participation of neighborhood organization leaders, cultural community leaders, city leadership, and other stakeholders in the conversation. As you know, neighborhood organizations have a long history in Minneapolis and have been working not just with the city, but of course a lot of other government entities like Hennepin County, et cetera. They work with businesses and others, the park board. So we want to make sure as many stakeholders can be involved in this conversation as possible. We want to make sure we have clear and ongoing communications. We want to develop consensus around some recommendations for roles and responsibilities of neighborhood organizations, as well as for the city in responding to and working with neighborhood organizations. Also ensure a smooth transition of community participation program funding after 2020. So the structure here basically will be NCR will work alongside with Neighborhoods 2020 Committee, which is a committee of the Neighborhood and Community Engagement Commission, and also with our neighborhood and community partners, especially the neighborhood organizations, but also others, and basically to participate in training and planning for these community conversations that we're proposing. So here are the basic roles. NCR staff, we'll do most of the heavy lifting on this. We'll organize this art of hosting training that I'll talk more about here in a second. We're going to facilitate the communication, help facilitate the planning, and consolidate the data and develop some initial findings. The Neighborhoods 2020 Committee of the Commission will participate in the art of hosting training, assist with planning and facilitation of these conversations, review the draft findings and recommendations along with us, and report these findings and recommendations to the Neighborhood and Community Engagement Commission. And finally, our neighborhood organization partners will participate in the art of hosting training as well. They'll participate in planning and facilitation of these conversations. They'll host the community conversations. They'll extend the invitations to other neighborhood and community leaders and assist with the review and findings and recommendations. And we did have a meeting last May with a number of neighborhood organizations. We asked neighborhoods if they would be interested in participating in something like this. We had some 15 neighborhood organizations show up at that meeting, about 20 people, a lot of board members who expressed a lot of interest in working and partnering with us on this. So I think they're pretty excited about it too. So I just want to walk through the timeline quickly. First, this fall and winter, we'll do some training in the art of hosting. The actual proper name of this particular facilitation methodology is called the Art of Hosting Conversations That Matter, and it actually has a number of techniques within it, such as open space technology, world cafes, things like that. And so the Neighborhoods 2020 Committee will be involved in this, NCR and city staff, cultural community representatives, and of course our neighborhood organization partners. That training process we'll be using as planning as well for these community conversations. Those conversations then will happen in early 2017. I'd like to have 4 to 6 conversations around the city. If you remember the 2014 community dialogues, something like that. Invite other. So we're going to ask the neighborhood partners. Their role in particular will be to host the meetings, do the arrangements, to do the invitations to other neighborhood boards, to cultural community leaders, to city leadership, to other stakeholders, again, such as businesses, park board, county, et cetera. So that'll be in early 2017. Once we've had those conversations, then from April to June, the proposal is then we look at the data, what did we hear from people, and start developing those findings to take those back to the Neighborhood and Community Engagement Commission in 2017. And then through July to March 2018, working on developing some recommendations for the future of neighborhood organizations. So we'll work with NCR, the Neighborhoods 2020 Committee, along with our neighborhood partners, review the recommendations with stakeholders, do a 45-day review and comment period, and then do final development of the recommendations with the Neighborhoods 2020 Committee to the NCC, the NRP Policy Board, and City Council by March of 2018. So again, here's our recommendations. So if I can really quickly have Dennis and perhaps Marcus come up really quickly and just talk about sort of the Neighborhoods 2020 committee work and neighborhoods, their interest in this too. So, Dennis,
Hi, I'm Dennis Fazio.
Welcome.
I'm the treasurer and on the board of the Bryn Mawr Neighborhood Association, and also on staff of another neighborhood association. And we're kind of excited about this. When Mr. Thompson had the meeting back in May, a lot of neighborhoods showed up and they expressed great interest. For neighborhood associations like us, we're looking to engage our residents more, and this would be something that would allow us to do that. The partnership with both NCR and NCEC would be a great one. So our ability to not only work together, get the neighborhood people out more. I mean, if we agree that having neighborhood associations and having residents participate in their neighborhoods together is a good thing, this would provide a nice venue for that. And not only what are we going to do for the future, but provide a mechanism for learning how to hold discussions over a longer period of time on other issues.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Bender has a question, and I'm not sure who the question's for. Okay, go ahead.
Hello. Having spoken before you a few times, I don't know if you want me to give the whole spiel, like who I am, what my address is, that kind of thing, or is this?
Sure, why don't you introduce yourself
Okay.
for us and for everybody?
Okay.
And then go ahead.
Marcus Mills, 309 6th Street Southeast. I'm also a board member to the Marcy Homes Neighborhood Association and co-chair of the NCEC's Neighborhoods 2020 Committee. Basically, what the 2020 committee and well, I specifically wanted to add to this particular presentation. As Robert said, we're trying to put together team sets for NCEC and NCR specialists to go out to the neighborhoods to be part of the training for art of hosting, to be part of the conversations that are kind of spreading through the neighborhoods, and to assist in the process of outreach into communities that are regularly not necessarily at the average neighborhood association meeting. Personally, I happen to be very particularly advantaged in that the I, being the District 4 NCEC member, and our appointed member, or the appointed member who happens to also live within the territory, we are well acquainted, as we are with our the NCEC members who handle the parts of District 4. And so we are a naturally cohesive team to go out into District 4 to handle this. We intend to create similar teams amongst the rest of the districts in the NCEC, so that all of the city can have a cohesive team that will be coming out to assist with this process. And we hope to be able to create not just worthwhile conversations, but the kind of conversations that can help us come up with the proper and most effective solutions to designing and deciding on the best ways to continue to fund neighborhoods beyond 2020, and to be able to handle several of the issues that most of us understand can be points of concern and things that we need to improve and change about how our neighborhoods run, how our city communicates with our neighborhoods, and how the communication systems that we've created are useful between these. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Have a great day.
Very helpful. You too.
That concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Councilmember Bender?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That was loud. I wondered if any thought had gone into expanding the engagement beyond the neighborhood organizations themselves. This seems like a really important time to make sure that folks who may not be attending the monthly meetings for any reason or another, who may have a different viewpoint from the neighborhood boards as they sit today, might want to be involved. So I didn't hear anything other than talking with the neighborhood organizations.
Chair Gordon and Councilmember Bender, yeah, thank you for your question. And actually, that is a part of this, is that through those community conversations, the idea is to extend that invitation again, not just to the neighborhood organization board members, but to the cultural communities. And I think not just for the neighborhood organization boards, but NCR staff, through the A&O team can help with that as well. Just stepping back here. Whoops. So that would be part of those conversations. We noticed the cultural community representatives will be really important. And so I think that's, again, part of the role that we can play. And the staff, we have 3 staff from NCR actually that will be supporting this effort. Myself, Michelle Chavez, but also right now Tina Kendrick from the Access and Outreach team as well. So that we want to make sure that both of the teams are working with this group on that as well.
So it also looks like that in February and March of 2017, there'll be these community conversations, and I'm assuming those will be they may be co-hosted by city staff and neighborhood organizations and NCEC, but they'll be open to everybody, and there'll be outreach, and there'll be maybe an opportunity for council offices to help publicize those meetings and turn out people as well.
Yeah, Chair Gordon and council members, absolutely, yes.
Okay, that looks good. Are there other questions or comments? I just want to also be clear that part of the recommendations, and this is pretty clear when in some of the discussions up there, but we'll be getting a first draft, I think it's set of findings next June with initial recommendations, I should say in June of 2017. And those recommendations will also consider recommendations about funding levels for the future and funding sources for the future.
It could include that. I think right now the intent was to focus more on sort of the role of the neighborhood organizations, and I think once we get to that, sort of identifying what that role and relationship is, then I think we'll be better able to identify some funding options at that point. But certainly we could start coming in for the talking about, if you're asking about sources, that could come in about that same time, sure.
Well, and I'm not directing you to do so. I'm more curious about what's happening. That's definitely a concern, an issue, and it's not, it wasn't raised up as a big priority necessarily in the engagement plan, but I think that's going to be definitely a topic that will come up because that's also the concern that we have because the funding for neighborhood organizations is set to end in 2020, and that's issues we'll deal with. And maybe there's other groups that can be working on that as well. And this is a kind of a community engagement part, but hopefully that should be informing all of that as well. Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's possible that where I sit, just from a specific perspective of a ward that's very young, a lot of renters who don't know who their council member is, usually much less who their neighborhood organization board members are and when the meetings are. But I want to emphasize again, I hope that these conversations all help us lead to thinking not only as not as neighborhood organizations as the only way that we are realistically going to be able to engage with our constituents on these important decision-making issues. And it doesn't mean that neighborhood organizations aren't important and that we don't value them and that we don't want to fund them. But I think just having that realistic viewpoint and helping us all work together to say, this doesn't have to be the only way, I think will help us get to those outcomes better. So I just wanted to kind of follow up with my question with that comment to say, I don't think it's either or. But just want to not lose sight of the fact that we're missing a lot of folks with just these neighborhood organization meetings. And I think some are doing really great work, really intentional work to try to reach out to folks. And I think everyone can learn from that and kind of highlighting those successes, but also looking at organizations that maybe aren't being as intentional. And so maybe when we, if funding comes forward in the future, maybe we would have some benchmarks and some ways to understand that we want to fund organizations that are being intentionally inclusive and not exclusive to folks who live in the neighborhood. So those are my thoughts as we begin this process. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I just agree completely. And I think one of the things we can start talking about is how can we get neighborhoods to do a better job of doing that outreach and being inclusive, and what kind of expectations should we have? So hopefully this process will really help with that. I think actually a lot of the neighborhood organizations struggle with the same kind of issues they're concerned about. Well, who's here, who isn't here? How do we improve that outreach and engagement? And I agree that neighborhood organizations can't be the only way to do that, but I also think neighborhood organizations maybe can actually do a better job of helping do that for their communities, but also to serve the city better. So, Councilmember Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just wanted to acknowledge the hard work of the commissioner who was here earlier today talking. I had the opportunity to meet with him one-on-one to talk about the shining examples of neighborhood associations in my ward who have done an extremely good job of engaging diverse communities, renters, and neighborhood associations in Ward 9 have been the only way sometimes that investment has been made in this racially concentrated area of poverty, which is a Met Council designation that covers almost the entire 9th Ward. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the impact and the outcome of these conversations. I know that we had a very in-depth interview where we talked about what could be replicable models that other neighborhood associations could use in order to ensure that the growing diverse neighborhoods, neighborhood residents are engaged in our neighborhood association citywide, and that conversation will be different from ward to ward because some wards have more diversity than others, and their interest areas are different. And I think that's a very unique and important aspect of our neighborhood associations is that each neighborhood association sort of reflects the interests and priorities of the people of the area, generally speaking. So I've been really proud of the work my neighborhoods have done, and I hope that we can continue to support them long term because that's a true Wellstonian legacy that I feel that Minneapolis has and upholds that's different from a lot of different cities across the nation. So thank you for taking this on.
Thank you very much. I don't see any other comments or questions up here. So thank you for the presentation. Thank you all for coming. And I am happy to move forward. The recommendations or requests to approve the engagement plan to develop the neighborhood's 2020 recommendations with proposed completion by March 30th, 2018. And also a resolution transferring $50,000 from the NRP post-2009 interest earnings fund to the Neighborhood and Community Relations Department and authorizing appropriate city officials to execute these contracts. Any questions on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed say no. That motion carries. That brings us to our 7th and our final item on the agenda. This is a grant acceptance from the Federal Department of Justice to our health department. I thought it would be interesting if we learned a little bit more about this. It's a significant grant of $325,000 over 2 years to implement the group violence intervention program. And
good afternoon, Mr. Chair.
Good afternoon,
Council. Give me
Welcome.
just a moment to pop my USB port in.
Sure.
Alrighty, good afternoon. As previously mentioned, we are here to discuss an OJJDP Department of Justice grant that was awarded to the city to implement GBI and to also incorporate our youth violence prevention national forum models with that GBI platform. One moment while we get our technology together.
Just, you can hit slideshow up there.
There we go. Perfect. So before we get started on the actual conversation about GBI, I thought it would be useful to give a little bit of background on how we got here and why GBI feels like an appropriate fit at this time. In 2008, Minneapolis began its targeted work on the issue of youth violence prevention by releasing the Minneapolis Blueprint for Action to Prevent Youth Violence, as I'm sure many of you know and are familiar with some of the work that we've been doing in the health department. The blueprint gained national attention shortly after being released and has been seen as a national model, particularly in using a public health approach to address youth violence prevention. Slide, please. In 2012, Minneapolis was invited to join the National Forum on Youth Violence Prevention. It's a very esteemed group. I think it's only grown to 15 member cities now, and it allows federal partners along with local cities to partner on the issues, particularly looking at youth violence as a community engagement issue and strategic planning. So our blueprint was revised as we joined the forum and has allowed us to really enhance our capacity primarily around early prevention and intervention. Slide, please. OJJDP currently operates under 3 particular frameworks as it pertains to youth violence prevention at the local, city, and state level. We are currently a member program of the National Forum on Youth Violence Prevention, as I mentioned. The other 2 initiatives are Defending Childhood, which focus largely on looking at the early implications of violence in the lives of children and how we can get out in front of that problem, as well as the Community-Based Violence Intervention Program, which provides funding to look strategically at evidence-based, multidisciplinary, community-based strategies, such as group violence intervention, ceasefire, and the Boston Gun Program. Slide, please. So our new OJJDP funding was a grant solicitation that came out in May of 2016 of this year. And it was a new funding stream that allowed cities to look particularly, if they were already a member of one of the 3 initiatives that I previously mentioned, at ways that they could incorporate practices from one of the other 2 initiatives. Cities participating were the only ones allowed to apply for this grant, so we really felt like it would be a good opportunity for us to be strongly positioned to be awarded the funding. Next slide, please. The Minneapolis Health Department did apply, and we added GBI as a part of our strategy. The group violence intervention model comes from community-based violence programs, which are implemented across the country. So it would be how we are enhancing our national forum work. Slide, please. On September 15th, we did receive a letter from DOJ and the Office of Juvenile Justice Programs that we had been selected as a grantee to receive $325,000 to begin the implementation of GBI as a core component of our national forum efforts. Slide. Formal research and field experience demonstrate that when communities implement GBI, they can expect to see up to 60% reductions in shooting and homicides. GBI is a best practice program by the Federal Department of Justice. It is strongly encouraged by cities, particularly those in urban densities where violence is on the uprise. It is a proven approach in which law enforcement and community members and offenders can work together to reset relationships and to come around a common goal. It's built on the school of thought of force deterrence, which is something that allows us to not only focus on law enforcement, really looking at how communities are most impacted by violence and having communities be at the table to really think about how violence impacts the community overall and sees law enforcement as a partner, a very strong partner, but also focuses on community moral voice as well as social services. Next slide, please. GVI, again, as I mentioned before, focuses on those 3 pillars. So law enforcement has a role, social service agencies have a role, and community members, who are also known as having a moral voice, play a very significant role in the implementation of GBI. Law enforcement's role is really to coordinate action against members of groups once they have been identified as perpetrating the large-scale level of violence in the city. Social service agencies are at the table to invite perpetrators of violence or potential perpetrators of violence to the table to offer them an opportunity to make changes in their lives before they arise to the point of being arrested. And then the community moral voice is really an important component that allows community members to be at the table and strongly encourage group members to understand how the violence is being impacted, or how it's impacting the community, and why it's so important for the violence to stop. Next slide. Data analysis is used, and this is a very important part of the work because it's important to understand that this is not arbitrary. We're not just targeting random people, but that data is a strong part of how we arrive at the people who are invited to the table as potential victims or perpetrators of violence. So a data analysis is used to identify which groups in the city are perpetrating the largest amount of violence, and it's also used to identify within that group who are the next likely shooters or victims of a violent act of either homicide or shooting. Next slide, please. Communication for GBI happens in 2 ways. There is a process called a custom notification, in which outreach workers or law enforcement may feel a sense of urgency. Maybe a young person has been shot or has been involved in some kind of an act where we feel like we need to reach out to them with a sense of urgency. Outreach workers are a key tool in this process as well. GBI leans heavily on having community outreach workers who are usually employed through a nonprofit agency, but often funded through city funds or a federal grant, in this case, potentially, that will allow those who are most impacted by the violence, who are living in communities, to really partner with the city on this issue and to be the moral messenger of the issue. So on the issue of custom notification, a young person who's been involved with group violence who we want to reach out to would be contacted either by an outreach worker or potentially by law enforcement. They would receive information about the options available to them, particularly through social services. And they may also receive an invitation to a call-in, which I'll explain in greater detail in a moment. The most important strategy of GBI is the call-in meeting. So call-in meetings generally happen 4 times a year. They're quarterly, generally speaking. Roughly 30 people are identified through that analysis that I discussed as being the next likely perpetrators or victims of violence in the city, particularly thinking about gun violence. Law enforcement, policymakers, community members, clergy, as well as social service agencies are invited to a call-in meeting, and at which time the people who have been identified as being the potential next perpetrator or victim of a very aggressive act of violence are offered the opportunity to really make a change in their lives. It starts with a real moral plea from policymakers that we believe in them, we believe in young people, we believe in their ability to change, but that the violence must stop. Law enforcement talks strategically about what will happen if changes are not made in the behavior being seen at the street level. And then community members are given the opportunity, particularly the model invites you to think about bringing in mothers who have lost children as a result of violence or former gang members to talk about why the violence really has gotten out of control and must be brought to an end. At the very end, social service agencies are available to offer services like housing and employment and education services, as well as outreach workers who can invite young people to participate in support groups, as well as ongoing case management to really help them turn the corner on their behavior. And the law enforcement message is very clear. On to the next thing. So the strategy, as I said, is a very clear collective message to people who have been identified that the violence is intolerable. There's a community moral voice message. There's a credible law enforcement message that the violence will stop and that they will be held accountable if it doesn't. And a genuine offer for help, which is also a really important part of this program and why the funding is so essential, because we really need to be able to partner strongly with social service agencies in order to ensure that they can meet the demands of the young people who come into this program. We know that housing is often an issue which can be a very financially burdensome issue for young people, and when they're living in areas where they feel like they can't change their lifestyle because it's holding them to something because of where they live, we want to be able to offer them options out of that community if that's what they feel like is necessary. We want to offer opportunities in education, whether that's GED or post-secondary options. We want to make sure that we can get young people employed. And so those are all things that go into the cost factor for implementing GBI. Next slide. Through the National Initiative for Trust with the Police Department, GBI is something that's been on the radar since around 2015. Through the National Initiative, it's actually one of the core principles, and so the police department has been receiving training on the law enforcement implementation of GBI starting in 2015, but a large-scale training happened in 2016 this summer with partners from Hennepin County Sheriff's Department, MPD, the U.S. Attorney's Office, as well as Hennepin County Probation and the Department of Corrections for the state. So this funding will really allow us to enhance our partnership with MPD to be able to roll out GBI in a way that is